and I'll keep checking this. If we go over an hour, I'll have to stop it and change the tape. So we'll start with the simple stuff, like your name.
My name is Joe, Joed, Brooks, Brooks the third. Strange because my father just did not know who to name after he was a junior. So.
Well, one of the other things I wanted to tell you while we're doing this, I'm not going to give you a lot of verbal, oh yeah, that's great, or talking back, because that puts my voice in the camera, and it just sounds weird to be, if we were
sure.
to use this for a film. So I'll give you my facial expressions, but I'm listening to you. Trust me. I'm not going to say anything, so it's not on tape.
Understand.
When were you born?
I was born in December the 28th, 1959 in Murray County to April Elizabeth Capps Brooks and Jody Brooks Jr.
So how old does that make you now?
That makes me 54 years of age now.
Okay. All right. And I'm going to actually ask you some personal historical questions. You were born in Murray County, right?
Yes, born in Murray.
Talk to me about being raised here in this area of the country, and school, where you went to school, and what kind of jobs you worked, that kind of stuff.
Being born in Murray County, we lived for a short period of time on the Kitchell farm below the Brooks farm on Dog Spring Branch, which is up at Pisgah Ridge, below Pisgah Ridge Methodist Church. Then we moved over to Knoxville for almost 11 years. So I was really raised over in Knoxville area from elementary school on, and then about the time I was probably around 11 or 12, 13, we moved back over to Columbia, Tennessee, went to Baker Elementary, then to Wilhoite Middle, and then Central High School in Columbia, where I graduated. So participated in the band, and 3 years of architectural and drafting vocational classes at that school too. But in the band, I played French horn. I was first chair All-State and third chair All-State my junior and my senior year.
Okay.
So.
All right. Did you work when you were in high school?
No, I did not work. Well, other than working on my grandmother's farm, and then I was loading hay for people or cutting tobacco for people. That was the only work I did. I wouldn't really call it real factory work or something like that. No.
It seems like that's what a lot of people have done in this area when they were growing up.
Right. Yeah. Tobacco, hay, putting together fences over and over again. There was a lot of that, or taking care of all the farm animals. We had chickens, we had ducks, we even had dairy cows, bottle calves that we bought from one of my cousins, about 25 of those, and we raised those on the side for beef cows on the side, in addition to the regular beef cows we had on the farm. And then tobacco and, we did do some wheat from time to time. Somebody came in and grew wheat on part of our portion of our farm. Clover, a lot of clover we grow, and then we try to bale hay on top of the clover. But that was just because we didn't need hay itself wouldn't help the animals. You needed clover; it had more minerals in it. And that helped the animals get by sometimes. But anyway, it's a long story. Farming and all that's a crazy world of itself. My grandfather was a real farmer. I think my dad learned a lot from him, but didn't know everything my grandfather did know. And so, but my dad loved farming. That's why. And then how I got to know this whole region, my dad was a dairy herd improvement inspector for the dairy farms. So he inspected farms 2 a day or 1 a day, all the way from Humphreys County all the way back up to Coffees County, the whole valley. There are places out here in this county I know he went to that are gone now. The business went away that I know he went to and would visit. I go past them every day.
You say that because one of the gentlemen I interviewed said that where the golf course is, that was the Horton's land, and it was a dairy farm. That was one of the farming that they did really was dairy farming.
My dad, the Todd farm across the river from Horton Park, my dad used to go over there once a month and collect samples for testing the milk. Butterfat, that was a big thing back then, to get butterfat in the milk, more money for butterfat.
Now, after high school, did you go to college? Now you were in the military.
Went to college, yeah. So initially I went to college, went into music, got out of music as a major for education, and then went into industrial technology with a minor in psychology and a minor in music. But I left school for a while, went into the Guard, full-time. Some of it was full-time, and worked in Columbia with 473rd Detachment 1 under Company D out of Centerville, but Detachment 1 was at Columbia with the headquarters. And I worked with them. It was almost 3 years of Guard, but I went back to college after that, went into ROTC and the Guard at the same time. But I jumped the fence and went regular Army as an officer when I should have stayed with the Guard, but they weren't very happy about that. But at any rate, but it paid a lot of bills, you know, and finally got my industrial technology degree again with a minor in psychology and a minor in music. Although MTSU, they screwed up the whole paperwork and it doesn't show a minor in music after all that music classes I took, playing horn and everything. I played in the concert band. I played in the marching band there, MTSU, the concert choir. Played with horn ensembles all over the state where we go to different places, play like horn quartets. Oh, man, there was a whole lot of stuff we got involved in. It was unbelievable. Orchestra. Played first chair orchestra. Played one of my favorite songs called the, what they call New World Symphony. I love that music. I don't know why it sticks with me. It has to do with rivers. So, yeah, I got to play the horn part on that, and I was probably the only guy that could play it triple F with a beautiful horn sound and play above the whole orchestra would still have a beautiful sound playing those parts. But you'd have to listen to Dvorak's symphony to understand it, the New World Symphony, to understand what I'm talking about. But anyway, it's a long story. But,
you know, I was a music major when I was in school.
Really?
My first year.
Wow.
It's a little similar background there.
We used to be able to do anything. We could sight read grade 4 music. A lot of people have flipped out over that. We could put grade 4 in front of us, sight read it. We could sight read transpositions. There were 4 of us. We would switch parts on T. Earl Hinton, who was the director at the time. He looked like Hitler, but he was a really nice guy, though. But we would swap on him, like John McHenry would play 4th, and I would play 1st, and Brenda Morris would swap around, and we had this other guy. We all would just swap parts, and he never knew the difference of who was playing what, because we played the same. We played the styles the same. All the parts played the same. It was like one horn, even though it was in chords. It's unbelievable. The people from the Nashville Symphony used to come down and watch us. Yeah, they thought we were really good. Yeah, but anyway, that was a long story. But so I loved it. But
you went into the Army, though, at some point.
Right? Yes, I did. Right after I got complete, well, I was in the Guard. I did the basic training, AIT. Well, there was a boot camp at Fort Dix, and then my school at Aberdeen, Maryland. And then I came back to college, finished up college, ROTC, ended up at Fort Lewis in a real strange camp up there called Adventure Bone with General Wagner. He was a madman, but there was method in his madness. But anyway, that came out of that camp. That was something else. And then I got my commission as a lieutenant. I worked full-time as a lieutenant at MTSU as a Gold Bar recruiter for about 7-8 months. 6 months, 7 months, I can't remember now, before I went active duty and I went into artillery at Fort Sill. I did my basic officer's course there. And then I finished that up, and I was the bottom of the class. I was kind of like Custer. You know, I had a rough time with gunnery. And then I came to 2nd and 41st Field Artillery in Germany, and that was amazing. Colonel Edward Stotts, the man had grown from being a soldier in artillery to a lieutenant colonel in artillery. He was like a doctor's degree in artillery. The man knew manual gunnery backwards and forwards. So he took us for 6 or 7 months, all the lieutenants, put us under NCOs. We trained on manual gunnery again. He did all kinds of things that we didn't even learn at the school. And so he really squared us away as lieutenants because he didn't like us staring at the computer every day, and so the computer starts screwing up and we didn't know what the heck was going on. It would be something that and so I was fortunate to have a man who not only had the technical side down, he was an awesome leader. He had unbelievable leadership, just ability. And being around the man every day, watching what he was doing, we just couldn't believe the decisions he made. It was unbelievable, the things he did for his soldiers in the unit.
So the background that you got there in the military and doing artillery and being a lieutenant and things like that, does it play into what you do now as far as?
Yes. We did a lot of map reading. And we got to be so good at map reading, all the lieutenants under him. We could walk up to a site at Grafenwehr. Of course, Grafenwehr's got freaking known points all over the place. I mean, they got survey points everywhere. But we could walk into a site and to put a grid down, just a map spot, and the guys would come up with their computers from the survey teams, and they'd look and say, oh, you're within 10 feet. Let's fire off of it. And the colonel got us that good. We could turn angles through the countryside. We didn't use the stuff they use here in degrees. We used it in mills, much more finite than the degrees. So we were very, very particular about our surveying. We had to be very, very much exact on. Mills, when you're shooting 8 or 9, 10 miles out, mills works better than degrees. Degrees, you can lose practically half a football field to a football field going that far out. So, but at any rate, that was something I learned, map reading big time. But I loved maps all my life. From high school, from the vocational classes, in drafting, we did a lot of maps then. So from that point on, I just love maps. So, but there are days when I'm on this river, I go down, I freak out, and I'm going, wait a minute, I'm in the wrong place. Then I realize that the stream beds in the computer system had put the stream beds in the wrong place. The small streams coming into the main river. The river itself, the way it turned, and the mile markers are right. It was just the little beds were off, just probably by 16th or something like that. Because computers, I don't know why they may have corrected it the last few years with the later maps. I don't know. But I've always had that little problem every once in a while. But
so how did you go from military experience? I guess my question is, what brought you to the Duck River and the love of the duck, and to what you do now, to your passion now?
A bit of a miracle. If you saw me as Saudi in the Gulf War and somebody walked up to me and told me that I would be doing something like that, I pulled my pistol out and shot them. I was so hardcore back then. But what happened was a bit of a miracle. There was a part of me that wanted to float this river since I was a boy. I'd heard of people doing this. My cousin, Waverly Jackson, and his grandfather, who was a colonel in the engineers, Colonel Jackson, and his father, who was one of the vice presidents of First Farmers and Merchants Banks. I forget his name. He was a Jackson, Waverly's father. They all went floating this whole river from Normandy all the way to the end, and they told me stories about it, and I just went, oh, man, I want to do that one day. I'd heard stories of other people floating the river, and I said, man, I got to do that. I want to do that. And we go down and play along the river down around Columbia, swimming in the gravel bars and stuff like that with my Uncle Miles caps. But I never even thought of, until after I got back home and I said, man, that's one of the things I'd love to do. It wasn't exactly the bucket list, like the movie bucket list, but it was just something I wanted to do. But I started on the Upper Buffalo floating, and some of the older guys up there started teaching me. It was rough running that part. And then I transferred back over to the Duck River, but I love the scenery on the Duck. I mean, I really love this river. And so I said, man, I got to float every bit of it. So what I did it in sections. I do 9 miles here, 9 miles there. And some stretches I've done 50 times, some 30, some 10. A few sites I've only done once, but I've covered from Normandy all the way down to Honey Point, which is 5 miles above the mouth of the river. And it's by a miracle that I did all that. And then Bob Duncan and them found out I was keeping notes on my maps down in Murray County. That's back in 2001 or 2. Bob brings me, and I'm thinking, Bob knows everything, man. Bob really knows everything about the river. Bob was like flabbergasted. He said, you know more about the river than I do. There's stuff that he knew as a boy, but only from the section of Parsons Bend all the way down to Williamsport where he grew up as a boy. That's the section of the river he knew. The rest of it he didn't know. And there were notes I had on there that he was like, wow, these are shoals, there's mill dams. So what he started initially having me do is go back and look at all the mill dams on the river and map them in. And then, of course, we didn't know the names for 50% of them. People sitting there scratching their head and going, oh, I don't know, that's Harry's Mill. I don't know what mill that is. But over the years, we now nailed down about 99 to 98% of the names for the mills. Not all the names, but at least some of the names for each site. And there's over 50 sites above Columbia, and that's being very conservative on the main stream, not talking the tributaries, and then at least 4 to 6 sites below Columbia. It's unbelievable. And that's one facet of the river that I didn't realize. The other part is I got more involved in. It took years to to research and work on was the navigation side. But there was clues in all the documents, old historical documents, but I didn't understand the clues. I had to go start reading all the documentation that people had done along Virginia with the Virginia Navigation Canal Society. And there was a gentleman there I from time to time I would talk to on the phone or letters, is William Trout III, and he started the Virginia Navigation Canal Society. One of the founding fathers, and he went down rivers like I'm doing now and mapping out all these old formations in the river, which were either wing dams in the river or mill dams or slopes on the dams, on and on and on. This guy was an expert in that area, far way ahead of me. I was working on stuff, but I didn't realize what this guy was doing. So by linking into him and reading through documentation, I started going back and looking at our stuff, and it just opened up a whole nother world. I've been ignoring things like the word slopes on dams. I was thought, oh, a slope is just a slope on the dam. The slope is actually a opening in the dam. It could be a 100, 150-foot wall that's oblique to the dam, and there are two walls, and then boats go through that. That's a slope. And it's not a lock, just an opening through the dam for boats to get through. Then the other things of wing dams, what they meant, sluice navigation, never understood that till I got a hold of a book that Trout told me to go read, Mr. Trout, and it was called Dan Guzzi's Upper Potomac. And on it talks about sluice navigation, and we got documentation that talks about that on all of our documents from the Tennessee State Legislature. There's tons and tons. When WIPA redid all the books on that, their documentation, it's unbelievable the amount of not talk they have about sluice navigation, which is behind islands. And many mill sites I'm finding on this river, there's a mill dam, an island with a sluice behind the island, and then the mill across the river from where the island is, or the mill is in the back channel. So there's something going on there. I think there were different stages, at least 4 or 5 stages of navigation on this river, but it spanned from 1812, 1811, all the way up to about 1860 at one part. And then there's another section of the raftsmen using the river from the 1860s to the 1880s and 90s, and then the lower part of the river being used by a group of steamboats from various companies and lumber companies using different types of boats down there from about 1890s, 1910. That's another phase, which is the last 26 miles of the river. So there's different phases of that. And then, of course, between the mills and navigation, that's the biggest part that I learned of the river, studying it. And I just got caught up in it. And I kept building one and I didn't really have a plan at first. I was making these versions of maps for years from 2001 up until about 2004 that were really horrible looking. And they even went to Tennessee Tech, and they kind of like, oh my God, they kind of turned their nose up to what I'd done as they were building an archives for Duck River Agency, and I didn't blame them. So I went back and used the Virginia Navigation Canal Society's types of map style, although I didn't use the topos. And I went back in and started redoing the maps, and the version 4 is the one you have, which is, plus at Murray County Archives, and the version 4A, which is updated, that I have at the archives, which has more information on it to clear out all the problems. But it's wild. It grew from that. I have like 9 volumes of small maps I call quick maps done on sites. I've gone back to the site 10 times, and I looked at the first map. It looks butt ugly. Then the next one I draw it, and it looks a little better and a little better, and I'm starting to notice things. And so I got better and better and better at making small maps. And those small maps I use to make the big maps. So at least it's locked in. It's not just that I'm making stuff up out of the blue. There was also about 2004 when we started working on the Blue Way project, first with the Middle Tennessee Visitors Bureau, then it got transferred over to Duck River Agency. I built an initial set of maps for that. And then from that version 4 grew. So, and there's actually, I think it's either version 1 or 2 is sitting down there. It's on a little plaque right now sitting down there at the Greenway down in Columbia. It looks a little ugly. It's got notes written and everything on it. It's one of my maps. But it's one of the original versions sitting on one of the plaques down there, right by one of the pavilions over there by the farmer's market. But which I realized, I said, well, I wish I'd gotten a better version than that one for them to look at than that, you know. But that's a long, long time ago. The other things that still make up this river is all the fording sites that turned into bridges. There were ferry sites there. The other thing that's really important is that I started discovering was all the fish traps down the river. And that was visiting the archaeological department because I had been working on native sites down through here. And I had to keep that quiet, so they wanted to get a whole thing on that. Then they brought out this book on fish traps. So you need to go back and start studying. I didn't know what a fish trap was. So he showed me, and I went back down the river, and I'm like, holy cow, in between the mill dams are fish traps that one time were probably 3 foot, 4 foot high. And they held up mill ponds for a mile, other than like the...
There's supposed to be one here, out in front of this. We were actually talking about that last night in the meeting. And Randy and I, along with one of the guys that's part of the Historical Society here in Marshall County, were talking about, he had suggested doing some research on the fish traps and the fording site. Especially fishing ford, since it was supposedly the first crossing of the Duck River. And Randy brought up that somebody, I don't know who, he may even brought up your name, said that there was a possible fish trap that you can see if you stand on the bridge now and look upstream, that you can see an old fish trap, or what was an old fish trap upstream. So I don't know. This is just what I heard last night. So anyways, that's to add to your stuff, list of stuff to do.
Now, the problem with that is what he's probably looking at was them 2 bridge piers that are sitting upstream. And then upstream of that is what there's remnants of another bridge pier under the water that you only see in low water.
Maybe what he was talking about.
And he's thinking there may have been a fish trap right there. But the thing of it is, for a fish trap to be there, your mill pond had been sitting there where the concrete bridge has been since about 1850s, 1860s. And that thing's been covered up all the way up to the 1950s. So and then here's the other problem. Back in 1821, 3/4 mile downstream, you had the Brass guy, or Green, they built their mill dam down there. It covered up fishing ford. They're talking about that. His mill pond covered it up. Probably that's why they had the ferry boat there until they built the bridge in 1830s. So the first bridge in 1830s. So that whole area would have been covered up anyways. There would have been no place to put a fish trap. Now below that, there may be fish traps that are covered up by the Lillard Dam, somewhere down in between where the mill pond from the Williams Mill, which is at Powell's Bluff, covered up into where the 2 mills, whether it was the Greens Mill or this mill up here that was built a later date. So one of those 2, there could be fish traps in between that we don't even know about.
Let's see. So I'll get into some details about mills and things like that, but just as an opinion piece, what is your favorite part about what you do on the river, about the work that you do historically?
It never amazes me. The river keeps its secrets, and then you can go down the river like Parsons Bend for 5 years, and Mr. Jones is sitting there telling me there's a fish trap there. And I'm going, no way, there ain't no fish trap. He's smoking dope. And then about 1 year, the river, as a big flood comes through and clears out all the gravel bar. And then you realize there is a rock wall under that gravel that leads off, and there's another wall on the other side. And that there's remnants of fish trap, and that the actual gravel bar or island off to the right of the river channel was formed where all the gravel piled up on top of the fish trap itself at the apex of where the trap was. Then you find a man like Mr. James Crowley Smith, who did a lot of research on mills in southern Middle Tennessee, who I got the idea of drawing mills and everything from him. James Crowley Smith had a drawing of a fish trap, and he was talking about these older men that when they were young were making fun of this old man that had a mule in the river and he was plowing in the river. What they didn't realize as young men or young boys, he was trying to clean up all that gravel behind the fish traps so that they wouldn't get silted up. And what had happened in this case, coming back to this time of me and Mr. Jones, and then I finally see that fish trap, it had silted up over the years and created an island. There's no telling how many islands out there have been created from fish traps that we don't even know about. And the river keeps its secrets. And then 5, 10 years down the road, it just uncovers everything, and you'll see the rock wall. Then it'll cover it back over gravel, and you'll never see it again. And Anderson's Trap down below Williamsport, that thing, you see the timbers and everything for years, and now it's uncovered up by gravel. You don't even see nothing. I took Richard Quinn down there to see that. He liked to flip and said, Joe, where is it? I said, it's here. I know it's here, but the river's done covered it back up again. And so the timbers are right under here, and we dug a little bit, and we could find part of the timbers. So they were still there, buried under the gravel. Thank God. They'll be preserved for a long time. But that's what happens to the river, so you never know. It's like, I think last year, before I ended up in a I was out there canoeing. I went down river and come back up. And one day the river, for years, I've been watching right where the green or Brasses of Greens Mill, right there, 3/4 mile downstream. I've been looking at it for years, and all I saw was just a little pile of rocks on the left side of the channel, looking downstream, and in the gravel bar. Then one day, bam, all of a sudden it tears out a section of the island, and there is remnants of the mill dam, complete, with all the timbers, and I can't remember if there was any planking on top in this case, but all the timbers in between. Yeah, I couldn't believe it when I saw it. I was like, wow. The river uncovered that all these years. I've been on the river 14, 15 years. It took me to see that. The river keeps its secrets, and then all of a sudden it uncovers them. That's what I'd love to find, a freaking boat out here of some sort, whether it be a bateau or a flat boat or a keel boat or some type of dugout or small pirogue of some sort. That would really, I would just love to find stuff like that. That's what I'm looking for now. And I try to focus on where the shoals are, where there could have been wrecks, and see if I could find boats. And I'm still unsuccessful. But these farmers were probably very good salvage guys. I know the bridges have been washed away down like at Williamsport. Whole bridge got washed away, a wooden bridge, and the farmer went down there and took everything and incorporated it into his barns and his house. So the guys they're very good at getting stuff out of the river. And they say a wreck or something, so there's no telling what had been down there but disappeared over the years. And that's a whole other facet of navigation nobody understands. I had to go back along the eastern seaboard and study all of that because, a dugout and pirogue are two different animals. A dugout is what it is. It's dug out of a tree trunk. A pirogue, the original pirogues, there were different versions of them. They split the dugout and put boards in between and built a false stern and a false bow. That's what they did with pirogues. So they widened them out a little bit. They were still part of a dugout, but it was just the outer pieces of the dugout. Yes. And people don't know that. They're called piroguiers back then. And then they became more, as they went, they hand sawed the boards or the up and down sawmills made them. And then there was just a short version of a bateau, but usually with an up and down sail. You could lift it up and take the pole up and down. Yeah.
What's been the hardest part of doing your work that you do?
There was a lot of politics involved in different things. That's been the hardest part. People misunderstanding me, and that's people in positions of higher level, like within the Nature Conservancy, them kind of like, I guess my whole vision, at first I didn't really have a good vision. Over the last 4 years, I've come out with a good outline of what I should be doing, a plan. But before that, I didn't really have a plan as I was doing it. I was just piecing all this together and not knowing what to do with it. I had this over here and this stuff over there, and I'm trying to like how to make heads or tails of every bit of it, put it in perspective. And the last 3 to 4 years, I've been able to do that. But before that, I think people like the Nature Conservancy, they misunderstood a guy like me. To me, and they saw me as a threat because they wanted to promote the birds and the bees and the mussels. And me, I'm promoting history. And in some respects, one person made a comment, well, that belongs in that dusty archive somewhere. Well, no, it doesn't. All the story needs to come out. Not just the birds and the bees, but the history also. It complements each other. And so I'm honestly, there's a lot of things too that I know over time everybody's, there are different groups of people from county to county. So it's been hard to break through the barriers of people getting to know you and then trusting you so you can come in and talk to them with the historical societies. That's something else that's hard to do. over the years. But
well, I'm going to get into some details about the mills and
Mm-hmm.
the river and things like that. And this is not specifically about Wilhoite Mill yet. We'll get into that here very
Mm-hmm.
shortly. But so you told me how many mills. Tell me again how many mills you think were on the Duck.
being conservative, over 50 mills above Columbia. And that's being conservative. It's more than that on the mainstream.
And then what types of mills were there?
The types of mills we had are varied. You have your regular flour mill, then your grist mill or corn mill. You have the up and down sawmills that were replaced later with circular sawmills, either steam driven or turbine driven. Then you have paper mills on this river. There, and on some of the tributaries also, you have gunpowder mills on this river, being one, the Manchester Confederate powder mill that they built for a short period of time and then it got blowed up. Was actually a very modern operation for its time on a small scale. In fact, they were using a cadre from the Augusta powder mill to train at Manchester's mill before Nashville fell. So that's a whole nother story in itself at Old Stone Fort. And that was an unbelievable story when it came out of the blue. I at first didn't realize just how big it was until some things I found out by accident, reading through stuff. There's also other types of mills that were probably proliferated along this river. The cotton mills, and there are two different types of cotton mills, because a lot of times there was so much machinery they couldn't run all the machinery in one place because of the power needed. The river didn't have enough power. So you have a spinning cotton mill in one place and then a manufacturing cotton mill which would make cloth or clothing or whatever in another place because the machinery required too much power to do.
My wife and okay.
Right, and there were cotton mills, which were the weaving mills or manufacturing mills and the spinning mills. Spinning mills just made yarn that could be sold in stores. Or they could take that yarn over to the manufacturing mill. And in the case of Shelbyville, there's a place like that. They had a spinning factory in Shelbyville, and 2.5 miles downstream they had a manufacturing mill, which became Sylvan Cotton Mills. There's mills that made rope on this river. Yeah, up around Old Stone Fort. And in fact, Whitman's paper mill, later after the Civil War, it had a paper machine to make paper. It also had a rope machine to make rope after the Civil War. And that's 1870 Census of Manufacturers. Whitman and Son or Whitman and Brothers, I can't remember. Anyway, but the thing of it is, there was also guys down here growing hemp down in around Cannon's Bend, which was right there, Horseshoe Bend. There's a little horseshoe right there by Sowell Mill Bridge. And there was also, it was called the, God, I can't remember the name. It was after Freeland built the mill, Smizer Brothers. They were one of the first to have reaction wheels in their mill, which is primitive turbines, about 1840s. Of course, there were ones installed in mills up here in 1826, 25, up at around Shelbyville. But the Smizers were actually making hemp for rope down there and building flatboats on the side and floating them downriver or paying people to run wagons down to Huntsville with the rope. One of the two things. What was the
most common type of mill? Was it a grist mill or a flour mill?
Grist and flour mills are your most common. And you usually had a sawmill. And then there were also water-powered cotton gins. Yeah, and baling screws up at the Three Forks Mill that were water-powered to make the bales. Yeah, so.
What, in your opinion, I guess this would be, or I mean, this may be fact as well. What do you think is the reason that the mills don't exist anymore? Can you talk about the downfall of the mills and why they're just not around anymore?
The big thing that shifted after the Civil War was that you had just before the Civil War, you had the rise of merchant mills. DeWiggins Mill over in Shelbyville had at least 4 or 5 runs of stones of steam driven. And it was a flour mill. It was producing tons and tons of flour, competing with the mills up and down on the river there in Shelbyville and upstream and downstream in Shelbyville. It was right at the railroad tracks too. So it's steam driven, didn't have to be water powered. It could run any time of the year. The amazing thing about that was you started having more merchant mills built after the Civil War in towns like Lewisburg and Columbia, which mill and elevator started about 1870s, 1880s. A Columbia Mill and Elevator, huge merchant mill there, produced tons and tons, almost 200 barrels of flour a day compared to the little mills on the thing on here. But now they had an awesome distribution system compared to the guys on the river. And what happened, most of the small tributary mills, especially like 1902, when they changed the postal routes and all that, 1901, 1902, killed a lot of communities. So some of those mills were next to those stores. They died from that because they didn't have the traffic anymore. And then your bigger mills like Wilhoite Mill survived all the way to 1950s. But if you notice from the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s, if you get hold of records, the mills start making more and more feed. They're getting out of the flour business by the 1920s, most of them, and they are actually going more to making cornmeal and feed, and bigger operation in feed. And Wilhoite was big on the feed at the end. The third mill was nothing but a feed mill because they didn't want to get into making cornmeal anymore or flour because they're competing with Lewisburg and competing with Blue Seal Mill, which is the old Columbia Mill and Elevator Mill, which was huge competitor. Then you have like Fountain Creek Mill over in Fountain Creek near Columbia. They started making flour. I've got documents where they had a whole 4-stand roller system to make flour, 50 barrels a day of flour. But then they got out of that, and all they made was cornmeal, but they were running rollers to make cornmeal. They weren't using stones. No joke, the last man that talked to me about that was Gene Lund, and he told me about he had a roller stand, 2 high roller stand, I can't remember, and then a single roller stand to make cornmeal. And he had a purifier, which they would use purifiers at cornmeal, and also a reel upstairs. And then, but his feed mill operation was huge. It got bigger and bigger and bigger, just like the Wilhoite Mill here. So I think feed operations took over big time because they can make more money because of the farmers coming in nearby, and everybody but you had to be careful with feed. Something I still don't understand the whole story. You just can't give certain kinds of cows versus horses. There's different types of feed you got to make for different animals. So that's a whole nother world in it of itself that I hadn't had time to research all of it.
The gentleman that worked here from 50 to 59, he was telling me about the feed mill operation and how they had different chutes for different animals. They had hog feed and they had the cattle feed.
Mm-hmm.
And he was telling me how they'd split it all up and chicken feed, and he was telling me that some of the folks that he delivered to, they didn't want it all put in one spot when they delivered it. They wanted the chicken feed out in front of the house, and they wanted the hog feed next to the hog pens, and they wanted the cow feed out in the barn. And so they had to keep it all separated, and it was very specific.
Wow.
It was an interesting story.
Because that's something I haven't still totally nailed down as a feed mill operation. I've done a lot of research on the sawmills. I've done a ton of research on the evolution of gearing and machinery for mills, flour mills and corn mills. And for paper mills, I've debunked a lot. And I've debunked about probably 80 to 85% on the machinery and evolution of machinery within cotton spinning mills and cotton manufacturing mills. But the feed mill has been something I just hadn't had time to fool with yet to understand it completely. But yeah, it took over big. You can even see 1880s and 1870s, since it's the manufacturers. You can see where they're starting to make a lot of feed, more feed than they do, every year.
We'll go. I want to talk to you specifically about the Wilhoite Mill and let your brain empty on the mill here and anything you know about the park site, the Horton, the house, the Wood House, and that sort of stuff. And then I'll move back to more general stuff with the river before we finish up for today. But just talk to me about the Wilhoite Mill from if you need to do it linear time-wise or however you're comfortable talking about it, where you think you can get the most information out. And I'll just listen. We've got 20 minutes left on this tape, and if I get it, we'll switch tapes.
Okay.
You just talk to me about the Wilhoite Mill and whatever you think is important to pass along. right now?
Really, the Wilhoite Mill begins with the Wilhoite Mill upstream in Bedford County, below Sims Bridge, within about a mile, mile and a half downstream of Sims Bridge. You have a Jacob Wilhoite, and then you have a William Wilhoite, if I'm thinking right. One of them got up in a court case in the Bedford County in Cannon versus Galbraith, and gave a deposition that he had installed. It was 1825-26, and 2 years before, he had installed reaction wheels in his mill, which are horizontal primitive turbines. They're not tub wheels. They're a big-time takeoff from tub wheels. That was the father of the son who eventually built the mill down here at Horton Park. That's why I'm thinking that possibly there was never any vertical water wheels here. Although in the pictures we've looked at, which it looks like there's a frickin' vertical wheel inside that building from that pre-1902 picture. It looks like it. I mean, but at any rate, they may have interchanged stuff around too over the years, which is just fine. But the father died within a couple of years of giving that deposition, and then the son ended up down here. The thing is amazing was that mill was built around 1819, 1820. It shows up on the Census of Manufacturers of 1820. They were also running a sawmill up there too. So it's kind of amazing that when they built the mill down here, they built a sawmill and grist mill. So actually, but yet I have no documentation from 1840s, and unless we just haven't gone back and looked at the county road system for the county court for Marshall County, and that they're writing about going below the mill in 1840s and 1850s. Then that would give us some indication that the mill existed, at least existed. But at least it had to have been by 1850s when this thing was built. That's my best guess for now. Because it's not showing up. It's showing up on Civil War maps, but it's not showing up on certain documentations prior to that I know about. Now, when somebody can prove that to me, then I'll believe it. 1845, 1847. The dam was built, and then probably more likely the sawmill was built first, and then the grist mill. Now, the sawmill, we don't know the location of it. Could have been many mills when they were built. Usually had a sawmill near them. It usually was downstream of the mill, on the downstream side of the mill. Sometimes they were on the upstream side, seldom were they were built across the river from the mill, because it had been kind of hard. You had to go across and go down and get over to that and go back over to the other mill with your people, or you might have different guys. You know what I'm saying, trying to supervise all of that. But at any rate, that at least started before the Civil War. And then you see it says Robinson's Mill in the Civil War. The original mill, honestly, I believe may have had horizontal wheels sitting inside it, because the son probably built reaction wheels just like his father did to run it. Later on, they may have converted over to vertical wheels. Who knows? I do know that by 1883, 82, 81, Leffel Manufacturing is installing turbines inside the mill. The 1880 Census of Manufacturers before that Leffel book talks about reaction turbines. Now, that could be interpreted as reaction wheels or turbines. I don't know. So there could be, there's at least some type of horizontal wheel sitting there in the 1880s. But when Leffel Company, I would love to get a hold of their records, because Mr. Wilhoite would have had to, John B. Wilhoite would have had to turn in a complete resume of information, all this machinery, so they could tailor the turbines to fit his mill to run it. He ordered 3 turbines, and I found out later that one of them was for the sawmill on the South Bank, which you can see in the the 1899 map. There's a little mill on the South Bank. That's a sawmill. And then the other 2 turbines were for the mill on the North Bank. So that picture of that building we have today probably had turbines in it. But then you see that picture, it looks like a vertical wheel. So who knows what was going on? There may have been a vertical wheel before they installed turbines in there. And it may have been a picture from the 1870s and 80s for all we know, or 1890s. The mill itself, it's hard to say what kind of machinery was in there initially. The 1880 census manufacturer says 2 sets of running stones. More likely, one of them sets of stones was for corn mill, and the other set of stones was for wheat flour. And they had elevators in the mill. When you see the pictures of the original building, you can see pipes sticking out the side of the building. That's from cleaning machinery, and more likely that's machinery. Those are wind tunnels running to those pipes that are wooden, more likely, not metal. The metal would have sparked. You had to have wooden wind tunnels. And those tunnels are coming off of cleaning machines. Cleaning machines were manufactured by plants by the 1860s, late 1860s at least. So the type of machinery I'm seeing at Falls Mill, like the Invincible cleaner and the Invincible horizontal scours, would have been the type of cleaning machinery that had more likely on the 3rd floor, because you didn't want to put anything on the You didn't want to put your reels and stuff on the 3rd floor. They'd probably clam up from all the heat and humidity in the summer. Your 3rd floor was better off with all your cleaning machines. Although Henry Horton talked about reels being on the 3rd floor when he went through stuff. And then I sat down with him about 2003 and 4, and he started talking about the roller mill system, which was a later period after the 1902 flood. There may have been a roller mill system installed in the late 1890s. We don't know. And there's no way of knowing until we get deep into the newspapers and find out what they're talking about. The thing that really amazes me is the roller mill system. He knew the 1st floor and the 2nd floor by, it was just unbelievable. I could say this is the riverside and this is the roadside and the community. Where's the machinery? Where's the bins? Where's the flour bins? Where's the clean grain bin? He identified every bit of that. The 3rd floor is where he kind of got mixed up, and he was going, I don't know. There was reels up here. This was up here. But no, this was all this. So these cleaning machines were up here. But he actually identified a lot of stuff. At first, he was telling me, I don't know, I'm not going to be able to help you. And then I took all these pictures from Spalding Mill, Ringo Mill, and Fall River Mill that I made drawings of. And he went, oh, I know what that is. That's a purifier. And we had 2 of those on the floor over here. And I know what that is. Those are cleaning machines. Those were on the 3rd floor over here. Yeah, so he knew exactly what the machines were. He didn't know what vendors they used in the mill, the type of vendors they had at that time. But it's really amazing just when I had all them other pictures, and of course he had strokes. But still, with the 3rd floor, he was kind of mixed up. But when I came up with his 2 theories, I took Dedrick's Practical Milling and went back through that book. And actually his theories kind of mesh out for the 3rd floor. So there's stuff up there that he's talking about more likely was up there, combination of different machines. And there was things, I won't get into all the details of that. But it just amazed me for a roller mill. And there was no stones in the mill at his time. The stones have been taken out. There were rollers for wheat and there was rollers for corn. And there was a special type of rollers built for the corn mill. They were not the same type of roller stands that they used for wheat. At any rate, it was quite a reduction. I won't get in. I think sometimes he said 4-stand, sometimes he said 5-stand roller mill. It may have been more like a 5-stand roller mill from what I'm getting from documentation on the amount of flour produced every day. And so there was probably more roller stands than what he claimed that he had. But I don't worry about that. He talked about where all the packers were, where the bran packer was, the different flour packers, the corn mill packers. He knew exactly where all that was because he spent a lot of time on that 1st floor. He also talked about the fact that for backup power, if they didn't have the 2 turbines that ran the feed mill and the flour and corn mill, they had a huge steam engine. It was actually a vertical boiler. And he said that thing was the backup power if they ran out of water on the river. Now, sometimes they would take and combine all the power into 1 turbine instead of 2, but that's kind of hard because of the way that pit looks. I don't understand how they did that. That both turbines were sitting in the same open area. So there was no way to channel one water to one or the other. But there were flywheels on the side of the mill that hooked up to the steam engine. There was a huge flywheel on one side of the mill. So the steam engine would hook up to that, and that would run, sometimes they'd use it to run the packing machines. in addition to the turbines running all the machinery, because they've built up so much corn meal and flour in the bins that they were way behind. So they would actually go back, either not using the steam engine, they sometimes get the Fordson tractor that was on the other side of the feed mill, run it over there and hook it up to the flywheel to run those packers.
Just to interject, it's funny that you say that as well, because the gentleman that worked in the feed mill, I asked him about a Fordson tractor or any type of engine, and he said there was a gasoline engine that ran the packers sometimes when the water wasn't powerful enough to run them. And this was in the 50s even. So.
Amazing. I'd love to talk to that guy about the feed mill. I'd love to talk to him. He'd probably take them pictures from TVA that made them and tell me a lot more about them, that feed mill, because that's still kind of a big gray area for me.
Tell me about the multiple rebuilds, so the creation and then the 2 rebuilds prior to the final destruction of it. Tell me how that, what happened between there historically.
You're talking as in the different buildings of the mill?
Yeah, it was created, and then it was...
Well, that first picture was a pre-1902. More likely, the only thing was in that mill was stones, and then specialized cleaning machinery and specialized machinery to bolt corn meal and flour, reels, more likely. After 1902, definitely it's a roller mill system, definitely by then. That's when you bring in roller stands. Of course, they worked better than stones. It saved a lot of money. A lot of people are against me talking about it, but a roller mill can actually last way longer than a set. All the maintenance on stones, and then you run them down, and then you got to buy new ones. It's very expensive, a great deal of maintenance. Whereas a roller stand, those corrugation is going to last a very, very long time on the rolls. So you don't have to mess with them for a very long time. And you have Babbitt metal for bearings, so you can just re-pour your Babbitt metal and then just wagon grease. That's what they were using back then. It just amazes me because those things were built to run. And Phil Robertson did a study on Nordyke and Marmon rollers, the old types. They're just as good as the modern rollers and produce just as well, except the modern rollers have got all the gizmos. And when something goes down on the computer side, they're down. But he said they use ball bearings nowadays versus Babbitt. But ball bearings wear down, whereas Babbitt, you can just re-pour the metal. So your overhead wasn't really bad. Once you got those old type roller stands paid for, and that type of machinery they're using back then, God, the overhead wasn't over. It's like the Amish. There wasn't much overhead. They used kids to go in the mill in the morning to do all the greasing. And there were 2 different crews usually. One would start out the gear house and grease every fitting down. They didn't miss anything. Nobody missed anything. Every day they did this. You fitted with grist no matter what, because if it missed something could burn up and then catch on fire. Another group of kids would go up in the dark, up into the elevator heads and start greasing everything down from the cleaning machines on the 3rd floor to all the bolting machines and purifiers and all the other machines on the 2nd floor all the way down to the 1st floor of the packers. And then the other kids would work their way in along the shaft, all the bearings on the shafts, going into the feed mill and then going into the basement of the flour mill.
This was every single day?
Every single day.
And the reason they had to grease it so much was because it was so dusty in there.
Right. And you never, ever, ever want to assume that there was enough grease. Yeah. You put grease in there anyways. That's what they did because they didn't want nothing burning down. Probably when the mill burned down in the 1950s or 50s, it was because somebody didn't grease the elevator. They missed the elevator heads, didn't grease them, and that whole day they got to smoking, and then that evening they started smoking and worked them ways down till they got to the fire started and hit those frickin' dust bins and then blew up the whole building. Blew it up and blew up the feed mill.
So that was in, what year was that?
About 1950, 51, 52 is all I remember. It's before the 3rd mill was built.
So the mill was flooded in the 20s, right?
Yes, it was flooded in 1902 as it got washed off. Okay, the original, yeah. The one you see across the river vertical, that's before 1902. It got washed off. but they salvaged that building. Now, the story that Henry Horton told me, they rolled the building back up on logs. But more likely what they'd done, because the feed mill for the second mill complex was very much smaller building than the mill itself. So they salvaged material from the mill and rebuilt the feed mill. Now, the flour mill was built brand new. The flour and corn mill is brand new behind the feed mill. That's the second mill complex post 1902.
Up the hill from that.
Yeah, up until I think the fire was 1950 or 51. I can't remember right off the bat, but I have to go back and look at the documents. But there was so that mill lasted from 1902 up into 1950, 51, 52.
Okay.
Yeah, and then that third mill would be the feed mill.
Okay. All right. Let's see. What else can you tell me about the mills? Do you know much about the different ownership? I mean, was it always Wilhoite and then Horton took it over?
Wilhoite and then Horton, yes. Although the Civil War map, it mentions Robinson for the mill site.
What can you tell me about that? Do you know much information about that?
Anna, she was a Wilhoite, and her husband died, and she took her two sons down here. And she married a Robinson. And then he died just before the mill, supposedly just before the mill got finished.
The stories that I've heard is that he was a slave owner. Do you suspect that there were slaves used heavily in the creation of the mills?
Yes. And I would say they were probably worked as millers in the mill. In many cases, I bet they were trained as millers. Many of the mills had black men worked as millers. They were slaves, but they were trained as millers. So it's not without a doubt. Yes, there were probably white men working in the mills, millers, but you had slaves working there too, probably. And it's hard to say if the mill was probably an automated mill system. I don't know. There's nothing about the original mill up below Sims Bridge that it was automated. I know nothing. I just know about the reaction turbine. But they probably were using a pre-Evans system, which the machinery wasn't connected by elevators or by conveyors, and they were probably using the slaves to move product from one machine to the next.
So
Cleaning machines.
Is that what you mean by automated, is that you didn't have to move?
Right, you had elevators and conveyors to move product in between machines, whereas some of these mills didn't have that. So many mills, I fear, this would have hurt them later. It hurt the iron ore industry in the Western Highland Rim big time over this, but many of the mills used slaves to move stuff in between machinery. They didn't have to use an automated system. They had slaves to do that work. But you would probably be surprised, because John G. Sims up at Temple Ford, he had an automated system. And he bragged about it in 1820. He had conveyors and elevators in his mill in 1820. And his brother Walter Sims more likely had the same setup upstream in Shelbyville. So they were from Philadelphia, and that's where Bob, the famous Evans, who developed the automated system for mills, he's also the one that developed the first high-pressure steam engines in factories to build them, and then worked with a certain Shreveport, a guy, I forget his first name, that they built the engines for those, the design that he had for the type of steamboats that he wanted to use on the Mississippi and Ohio rivers.
We're pretty close to being done with this. Like we were just saying, the milling process, start with the historical milling process, how they used to do it. Drop from when the farmer or whoever would drop off their wheat or corn to when they got the final product back. Talk us through that entire process, and then you can tell us how it changed over the years later on.
Well, if you had to talk about, there were different systems. You had a pre-Evans, and then you had the Evans, and then you had what was called the new process, and then you had the roller mill systems. But every one of those systems, you had what was called, the farmer would do the initial cleaning at his farm. Usually they had some type of small machine to clean out most of the riffraff, if they could, of the corn grain or the wheat grain. They usually sacked it. So they would bring it into the mill, and then they would pour it into a receiving bin. Then it would go through cleaning machinery, which would do more cleaning, probably separating more rough material out of the grain, whether it's corn or wheat, and then a system that's called scouring, which would get rid of the smut and the dust off of the grains, whether it was wheat or corn. And then you had then the next big system was reduction, where you go onto the stones or the rollers, and you started reducing to what they call it a chop. And in this chop was mixed in the inner particles of the corn and the wheat, the bran, of other undesirable parts they didn't want, whatever. And then this would go back into what was called the bolting system. It would be the third major system. And bolting originally used reels. Later it morphed into using swing sifters and box sifters and level sifters from the roller system. But this thing would sift out the bran, the rough bran, and get rid of the bran dust, which would get the corn meal or well, especially the wheat, whiter, and then processing the inner particles of the corn and the wheat into cornmeal or white flour. And then you'd have the packaging, the mixing systems, and all that afterwards. Then, of course, some farmers, they worked off of a small, the miller took his amount, so much of his that he was by law, and then the farmer got the rest of it, took that home. And that was custom milling, although the millers, in some cases, did merchant milling where they were making enough from what they were buying from everybody that they could turn around and sell it to local stores or even to a store down in Birmingham, Alabama, or Chattanooga, Tennessee, or Nashville. So that was something else, a distribution system. So it was actually went from receiving it to cleaning it to reducing it and then going to bolting, which is an old term which we call sifting today. Most people don't understand bolting today. So we call it sifting. And that's the only way people in modern times would understand, but the old timers called it bolting. So bolting would sift out all the stuff that you didn't want that you can use for the pigs and the cows or whatever and run it through the hammer mill or whatever you want to do, make feed out of it. But then the good parts of it would end up being your cornmeal and your wheat flour and various forms of that and grits. Yeah. Then
how did that change over the years?
Well, you have a pre-Evans system, and then you have the Evans system, and then the new process, and then the roller mill system. There were some mills, like over in Leatherwood Creek, that ran a pre-Evans system. They didn't have elevators and conveyors in between the machines. They had a cleaning machine, they had the stones to reduce it, and probably you had to bolt on your own. You took it home and bolted it on your own because we never found a bolter in the mill. It's the Brooks Mill sitting on Leatherwood Creek, still standing there in a log building. Yeah, hewn timbers and everything with the stones on the second floor. Edwin Lavender just refinished that whole building. It belonged to my family from 1825-28 on. That mill lasted all the way to the 1930s, but it was a pre-Evans system. Evans is where you have the elevators and conveyors like John G. Sims at Temple Ford, 1820 Census of Manufacturers. He's got elevators and conveyors in his mill, connecting the cleaning machines to the stones for reduction and back up to the bolters for sifting out the cornmeal and the wheat flour. That's what he had. And he didn't have to have guys to transfer stuff in between. Now, some mills around here probably use various forms of that. They may have used elevators to move stuff, and they may have had the slaves to do some of the physical work and didn't really need to use conveyors and other types of machinery to move stuff from machine to machine. They may have used the manual labor may have been very heavy in the mill instead of the automatic system, which would have hurt them later on after the Civil War. Big time. They had to convert over and spend a lot of money, and then they got to pay these poor guys instead of feeding them food, that kind of thing. So that's what happened to the iron ore mills over in Western Highland Rim. They got behind by using heavy manual labor, using the slaves to do a lot of stuff that they should have been updating their equipment on, and that hurt them big time later on. The 1874 Depression really destroyed a lot of the iron ore mills over in the Western Highland Rim. But getting back to our mills here, they were progressing. I'd say the Evans system started some about 1795, but many mills in this region probably didn't adopt it. So I'd say about 1840s, 50s, probably some of the mills did. Other mills stayed with the pre-Evans system. Then after the Civil War, you have this evolution where now you're manufacturing cleaning machines for plants like Bernard and Lee's company, Invincible Company, Edward P. Alice Company are making tons and tons of different types of cleaning machines, from the receipt separators to scouring machines to all kind of other stuff. And then they're also making different types of bolting machines, reels. The reels for dusting out the bran, scalping off the bran, reels for getting rid of the dust, the bran dust, reels for bolting a flour. And on the cornmeal side, kind of the same story, making grits and cornmeal, whatever. A little more simpler on the cornmeal side.
When you say reel, what do you mean by that?
A reel is round. It's like a 3-foot, kind of a average of 3-foot diameter by 10 foot long. It sits in a big rectangular box, and it looks kind of funny. It's got 2 sets of augers underneath on the bottom, and those augers move whatever comes out of the whether it's flour or the tailings or whatever comes out from the side. But those reels were setting, they didn't have different jobs, but then that was probably when they went right into, after the Civil War, into the new process. The French and the Hungarians too, and there was this roller mill process got started, but they were trying to go for wheat side, instead of using maybe 1 or 2 stones, using 4 or 5, 6, 7, 8 stones to reduce the wheat. They hadn't gotten to the roller mill process. So they started using all these stones, so they called it the new process, because they had all these stones to reduce wheat and maybe 1 stone for cornmeal. But then upstairs they had a ton of reels all over the place, one for getting a bunch of them for scalping off the bran, the next bunch to get rid of the bran dust, and the next one's for processing different types of flour. And then they had maybe a bran duster to get rid of where the bran was coming off. It still had flour on it, so they're trying to get the flour off the bran. And you know, it's what it is, efficiency. So there was all kind of little things going on with the reels, but it took up a lot of space. Well, when the Germans and the Swiss and the Hungarians came up with a roller system, which you didn't have to waste all that money on all the maintenance on them wheat stones, and cost a ton of money when you had to buy new ones too every once in a while. They turned around with a roller system. It lasted longer, Babbitt bearings, and these guys could do the slow reduction. You could have sets of like 4-stand, 5-stand, 7-stand roller mills, and each had a double set of rolls. And each set of rolls, original rolls, were corrugated until they got to finer corrugations till they were like smooth rolls at the end, for the wheat to come out at the end. And that became the roller mill system. And that kind of took over from the stones, from the new process into the rollers. What you had in this region was what they called a short system roller mill and a long system roller mill. With Wilhoite Mill, 4 or 5 stands was a long roller stand system. If you went over to Fairfield Mill, their production of barrels of flour was 30, 40 barrels a day instead of 50, 60, 70 barrels a day. What was happening was that was a 3-stand system, which they called a short system, 2-stand or 3-stand roller mill system. The miller didn't have the money to buy the amount of roller stands this guy did. So with the roller mill system, your cleaning machinery became more complex. Now you got a receiving separator and a milling separator that did a lot more than with the receiving separator. You had a scouring machine, a steamer, washer, whizzers. The big merchant mills got into all this stuff big time. These guys probably just kept it simple, just receiving separators, maybe a milling separator, a scouring machine, or a double scouring machine. And that was just machinery just to clean. Whereas in the old system, in the old days, the Evans system and pre-Evans system, they used a rolling screen. Just one machine. It had a wire reel on one side and an inner wire reel, and all it did was take out all the riffraff, you know, and then tail off some dust. They had a fan that tailed off the dust. And then they came up with smutters because we had a big problem with smutting. The scouring machines developed from the smutters. And that was in the old days. So they morphed from that all the way to these intricate machines. And these companies like Bernard and Lee's were mass producing this stuff, and Case Manufacturing and Edward P. Alice. And so with these long roller mill systems, and then you had the long, like 4 or 5 stand on here on the river, down here at these merchant mills, like over at Columbia Mill and Elevator or Blue Seal Mill, they were running 9 or 10. roller stands, double rolls each. So that's 18 reductions versus him doing 8 or 9 reductions or 10 reductions.
But that make better flour?
Right, yeah, because he could, in many ways, he could make better flour doing what he was doing over there with the machinery he had. If they had good millers. If they didn't, and there was a big problem with the Lewisburg mill. They made fun of them all the time because they believed they were making better flour than they were. And so it got pretty hilarious. There was all kind of, Henry always made fun of them. So when you get to talking to him about that, you'll probably get in the whole thing about it, if he remembers it. But he said they would constantly, and his guy Mulder, the head miller here, he'd go over and do this little bit, walk out of the building. They don't know what they're doing. Now they were making excellent flour down here, still competing with these guys. So I have a feeling many people from Lewisburg and other towns were coming to the Wilhoite Mill and were getting their flour in addition to cornmeal for a long time. So this mill was still operating, competing with these big merchant mills. They even had a school here, from what Henry told me, where there were training millers, and some of them ended up being millers at the Blue Seal Mill and going on to Pillsbury, General Mills, and all them up in Minnesota and all that. Yeah, he was talking about that, and millers at other mills around the area. So they had a school going on here. The older miller, he was kind of semi-retired. He was training people and getting money on the side, but training people to be millers while his son ran the mill. I can't remember. I had to go back in my documents. You've got my whole folders and all that. I had to go back in that. But I remember him talking about it at a school. So I think there was a higher quality of product, and that was their niche. And they were competing. And I can't remember if they had markets down in Birmingham or Nashville or whatever on that part. We'd have to get with Henry on that. But they were definitely able to compete with these guys and beat them still. And people were coming to them for better quality flour than they were going to the merchant mill down there. I got all kind of documents where we can do this, we can do that. It's in the newspapers. It's kind of funny listening to the merchant mill down there. And
homemade versus industrial.
Yeah. So, but Blue Seal Mill was an excellent mill. For a merchant mill, is one of the best mills, because when they had the fire up at the Anchor Mill after this mill burned down on them, and they built the feed mill, they ran Anchor Mill to do their cornmeal and flour. Whether they bought a lease, I do not know. But while they were doing, then that thing burned down. Well, Mulder was thinking we need to transfer our contracts to somebody to keep our people happy. So he walked through all these mills all over the countryside, and he would do this little bit, walk out, screw them. He walked into Blue Seal Mill, and he went, these guys know what they're doing. These are the guys who can do their contracts. So all their people at their distribution system, they turned it over to the Blue Seal Mill. Yeah.
What, just to finish up, and you can talk as long as you need to, but give me some, or talk to me if you can think of some significant stories or funny stories or stuff you think that folks are going to want to know. It doesn't necessarily have to be educational material like talking about the milling process, but just the stories about the mill or the river or personal things for yourself or things people have told you before.
There was a machine on the second floor that was made to make ozone, to bleach the flour. Normally, wheat flour had to sit inside a building for a certain period before it bleached out. But that would be a waste of money and time. So they had to do the system while they were producing the flour. Well, this little machine looked like it came from Mars. And I didn't understand the workings of these machines. I'd seen 2 versions of them, and both of them were documented in Dedrick's Practical Milling, so I showed them to Henry Horton. He said, I know that's the one right there, and he called it Old Sparky. And he kept calling it Old Sparky. It looked like it was from Mars, the little machine. But actually what it was, the 2 different machines, one was made, the one that looked like Old Sparky was made for the big merchant mills. It was more powerful. Whereas this other one was made for normal mills that I've seen in other, like Brown's Mill and Reedville Mill, the parts. Well, Sparky, the one they had, was way too juiced up for the mill they had, really. but it kept catching on fire all the time. That's why they called it Old Sparky. It caught on fire. They had to watch it like a hawk. So what they did was they had rain buckets hanging from the second floor all the way around off of the roof somehow, and they're catching water. And when Sparky caught on fire, they'd run, grab the rain buckets and pour water on the thing. There'd be smoke all over the second floor. And they called that machine Old Sparky. And I thought that was kind of cute. And then there was another where they had some little machine I found at Courtner's Mill and at Ringgold and Spalding Mills, about that tall. It worked with the rollers. What it was, all the small stuff that was the inner pieces of the wheat flour were too small to go through the rolls, went through this machine to make more flour. And he was talking about it being on the second floor, and Ringgold had one on the second floor. But they put one of those things in. That was something where they used to get more efficiency and a lesser grade flour, but they got 300 or 400 more pounds of flour every day from that little machine, whereas that had been stuff been thrown out to the pigs. And they had a brand dusting machine that again, they scalp off all the bran, but they had flour attached to it. So that bran duster would do the same thing, collect all that flour off of the bran, and that saved them 300 to 400 or 500 pounds of flour a day or something like that. It was efficiency. Yeah, they got their production up by doing things like this to make more money. He talked about the guys going down. Now, Hardison Mill versus Wilhoite Mill is kind of weird when they were working out the gearbox, opening up the gates every day for the turbines. And over here, the guys did it the hard way. They just go down there. He said there was some iron bar that they hooked into. I'd have to show you the drawing, but they had holes in the gate. And as you raise the gate, they'd put this iron bar in to keep it a certain height. And there was a guy above that had a crank, and he was cranking the chains to pull the gate up. And then this guy would put an iron bar in a certain height. And then he'd pull it back out, and he'd crank it some more higher, and then put the bar in. Yeah, and that would let water in down the turbines. But over at Hardison Mill, they didn't need to do that. Hardison Mill, they had a big wheel inside the mill. It took 3 or 4 guys to turn the darn thing, but they had a wiring system, the cable system went all the way out there to where the gates were. They could open it from inside the mill. I don't know why the guys up here never figured that out. Henry never talked about that kind of system. They did everything manually, out in the cold, in the ice, in snow, rain, no matter what, every day, lifting them gates up with this bar and cranking the crank up there. And he said if they didn't watch it, that crank could start flying on them and throw that dude completely out of the freaking gearbox out into the mill pond. But that never really happened, according to Henry. But down at Hardison, they had this thing where they all inside the mill, and they're turning a wheel inside the mill instead of out there doing that. It's just different.
Mr. Fagan, he was one of the ones that opened the gates every morning down here.
Mm-hmm.
He mentioned it was all manual thing. Every morning, go down, open the gates up every night.
That verified what Henry told me then. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was all manual versus their system was more automated. Mm-hmm. But it would take 4 or 5 guys. Now, he talked about guys here. He said there were black guys and white guys working here. They're big, brute strength dudes. He said he needed them for their brute strength and not just their smarts at running the machinery and everything. They had to be really strong guys. And they would go down there. He was talking about one black guy. He'd go in there. He knew how to run. There were, I think, from the gears coming up from the 2 turbines and getting them into tandem, he knew how to throw that thing in with them gears running and do it just right. And a really rough, tough man and could get it done. Nobody else could do that. And he sat there watching as a kid when he would throw them gears into tandem so they'd all be running together, you know. I guess he was trying to get both. It's hard to explain it, but I mean, he was talking about how getting both of them running together so they could run off of one shaft. It was unbelievable. It was really hard to do while the thing was running too, and throw them into position and get them in gear. I was like, man, that just got to be the most unbelievable. He said the guy knew just how to do it just right. So if he didn't, it would have killed him or thrown him right out of the building.
It's amazing to me how advanced the design of the industry was for the time. I mean, think of how advanced it was. Even when it was created in the 1850s or whatever, you don't think of the gearing processes and the precision that was involved in this stuff.
And they were smart because, like the Japanese have modern machinery and they had this really old machine as a backup in the factory. The Wilhoites thought the same way. They had a hammer mill running inside the feed mill for the second mill complex. And then they had an old ancient hammer mill's backup when they needed more, to fill all these jobs. Whereas guys today get caught up in all, well, we don't need that old piece, and then you get in trouble. We're way behind now because we're using one machine when we should have had that old machine as a backup for the heavy periods, and then we can make all this stuff, make it product and meet the customer demand, because some guys get wrapped up in, we're not utilizing that machine too much. But see, the Wilhoites are smart, just like the Japanese. We need that machine around. We're not using it all year, but there are certain times when the customer demand is huge, and we got to have that machine as a backup. Yeah.
And then, tell me about what you think about the history project and the rebuilding the mill project and that sort of thing. I mean, you think it's a great idea? Tell me your opinions on that.
I didn't know what was going to happen when I wrote that outline back in January, February of this year, 2014. I didn't know. I mean, I just thought, and then gave it to you, and then you started running with it, and that blew my mind when I heard all that, because I really wanted to see a museum here. I think it's centrally located in the valley. Politics aside from Murray County, the things that have been going on, they've got now within the Historical Society down there, it's improved. There were all kind of problems with that bunch down there before. The newer group and younger people that are running that Historical Society, they work together as a team now. They're actually, for years I'm just sitting there going, I'm just waiting and waiting. There was all kind of problems down there. There was issues within the Marshall County Historical Society that we don't want to get into. I mean, there's all kind of problems there. They're an awesome bunch of people, but they need to start going back and recruiting more people and working together to start working on projects. But this, to me, was centrally located in the valley. It's awesome because we need to talk about the mills in general. We could never really bring back what this mill really looked like. We might get lucky. We might find out information that tells us. But then again, we can talk about the mills in this valley and honor what these people did, because that's a forgotten world. And not only that, about the communities, about the fish traps, the fishermen. You had the grabblers, the grab hook guys, all them crazy dudes out there on the river that were fishing. You have the navigation of the river. I mean, you can address all of this, even ferry boats. And in steam engines, you could have all kinds of things going here, festivals where everybody brings combustion engines and steam engines here. Because, they actually had steam engines as backup for the mill. Of course, it was a huge boiler system, upright boiler. And so those are things you can expand on, because you got people around here, Nashville, Murfreesboro, Columbia, and people are having to spend a lot of money nowadays to go far away. And this place is nearby, and people can come here more and do more things here if we actually get more organized to do things like different types of festivals. We have a festival for mills, probably a festival on one day where we're running boats down the river. Everybody's floating together down the river. A festival like that, just for the navigators, what they used to do. Have another festival on steam engines and even talk about sawmills. That's a whole nother world. We had sawmills running here for years. There's still the railroad tracks buried under the mud where they were running the little carts with logs on them down to the sawmill on the south bank down to where the concrete bridge is today. There's a whole nother world of things we could do. And then we could address the farm. We had the dairy farm, beef cows, all kind of things going on here. We could have a whole different festival here where guys come and looking at different types of tractors and different types of farming machinery. Everybody brings in stuff for people to look at. And they'd have guys here to interpret and talk about the different periods and how all that worked, so that children from the cities could understand what this is. Everybody's forgotten all this. We could bring it back alive and really bring a ton of people in here. Of course, you may have to have more parking lots and a lot more, it may be a lot more going on, you realize, but those things could really bring a lot of revenue in here, and probably have to give money away to everybody else. to keep them running, the other parks running. So, I mean, honest God, truth, it's tremendous. This is centrally located, and it could be a most awesome thing, not just the mills, but the farms, navigation. We could even talk about ferry boats out here one day, build a design of a ferry boat so people could see what they looked like if we can get close enough to what it was. On and on and on are different versions of ferry boats for people to look at and talk about how they operated and what they did with them, on and on and on. People would flip out. They'd be, it's bringing stuff back to life. Pictures 1,000 words. And kids seeing all of this, they will never forget it as long as they live. We've got to preserve, and not only just that, we're honoring what other people did to get us to where we are today. It's our way of honoring their sacrifice. Not just because they were soldiers, but because they were farmers or millers or fishermen and what they were doing out here. Even the fishermen, you had the grab hook guys, they were out there trying to get the yellow horse and red horse, getting into fights with the guys in the boats because they were coming through the shoals, sitting on the stairs, on these little stands they would build on the bar, trying to put their little grab hook thing out there trying to catch yellow horse and get in a fight with the guys down on the fishing boat that's disturbing their fishing place. And then you have the grabblers, man, they're a crazy bunch, going out there and grabbling in the holes and pulling fish out. And you had the log fishermen and then the fish traps, in which whole families work together on fish traps. There's crazy stories on that stuff where people played jokes on each other and on these fish traps because people had to watch them overnight because you had these guys called thieves. They were fish thieves. You didn't watch your trap at night, he'd come in and steal all your fish. That was another thing that went down. The farmers, 3 or 4 groups of farmers would watch a trap. There was a whole world with fish and wildlife getting into a fight with the trap, all the fish traps. They wanted them outlawed. They'd blow them up. The next day they get rebuilt, and then the guy would go back down there. Who did that? And all the farmers said, I don't know. You know who built that? Yeah, that kind of thing was going on. So there's a whole other world people are not even aware of. It all revolves around the river. And I'm lucky to find all this stuff out over the years. I just feel very thankful I've lived long enough to learn all this. And I just hopefully that we pass every bit of it on for children. Not just me knowing all this, that everybody else knows about it. Yeah. I don't know what else to say.
That was good. That was real good.